don't you love that video? We used it some years ago for Thanksgiving, and you may think, it's not Thanksgiving. Pastor Terry, you're an idiot. Well, that may be true, but they have Christmas in July. Why can't you have Thanksgiving in July? And we want to reflect on, as we get ready to come to God's table, to Christ's table today, on this meal, this sacred feast that we share together. And so we want to share about how big is your table. Now, today's going to be a little different. If I haven't met you, I'm Terry McHugh, the executive pastor here at Garfield, and I'm going to be team preaching with Pastor Chip. However, he's not in the building. He's going to come in by video because he didn't want to miss, but it's his birthday. So if you can send him greetings saying, "Dear Dr. Chip," that would be fantastic. And maybe you want to sing happy birthday and send it to him. Whatever you can do to annoy him, yes. That would be a great, guys, can you scrub that part? But miracles happen at the table, right? I mean, this video really showed a miracle of people that never would have been together. Just like we never would have been together here at Garfield if it weren't for God bringing us together, as different as we are, as many things that could potentially divide us. We want to talk about being at the table, and connections happen at the table. That's why our microchurches and many of our small groups meet over a meal, and you heard Flora talk about Millennial Monday. It's always over food, because there's something that happens when we connect at the table, when we experience communion. And we think back to the early church, when they gathered together, the book of Acts says that every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts. They did it every single day, not just on special occasions, but they gathered together and celebrated communion. There's an old African proverb that says, when you have more than enough, build a bigger table, not a higher fence. You want to build a bigger table, as big as possible for all of us. And so as we prepare to come to God's table again, as I said today, Pastor Chip and I will be talking about staying at the table as we finish our short little series on 3 simple rules. Pastor Chip has shared, it's based on this little tiny book by Bishop Job. And what he did in this book is he took the works of John Wesley, who was the unwitting, unintentional founder of the Methodist movement, and kind of distilled into 3 rules, 3 simple rules. The first was do no harm. The second was do good. And today we're going to be talking about staying in love with God, particularly as it relates to being at God's table, at the communion table. Reuben Job, the author of the 3 simple rules, said, the rules are simple, but the way is not easy. They're simple rules, but they're hard to follow. Now, the first 2, do no harm and do good, really anybody can follow them. You don't have to have God in your life to follow those. But this one, stay in love with God, well, it's self-evident. You need to be in relationship with God. And while we can live out those first 2 rules without God, at least for a time, without being in love with God, it's impossible to keep up that outward focused kindness and compassion and empathy to people, where we seek to do no harm, where we seek to do good. We simply don't have the wherewithal on our own without God unless we're staying in love with God. And Wesley put it this way, talking about the importance of loving God. He said, the great question of all then still remains. Is the love of God shed abroad in your heart? Can you cry out, my God and my all? Do you desire nothing but God? Are you happy in God? Is God your glory, your delight, and your rejoicing? It's big questions. You know, it's pretty easy to fall in love, right? My husband and I, Joe, he's back there. He didn't know I was going to talk about him. We've been married 44 years, together 45. I know, right? Now you're supposed to say, Terry, you do not look like you're old enough to have been married almost half a century. Well, I do look old enough. But we've been intentional over the years to keep our love alive and to do things for one another and with one another. And even as simple little things, like there's a note that I keep on my desk that Joe gave to me. Isn't he an incredible artist? But it helps us to stay in love with one another. The same thing's true with God. I remember when I first came to Christ as a young adult after being away from the church for many, many years, it was being in love with God. I couldn't get enough prayer. I couldn't get enough scripture. I couldn't get enough worship. I just couldn't help it. I was so infatuated. And then I found, maybe you found this yourselves, that over time, if you don't do things to keep that love alive, you can take God for granted. You can lose your passion. You can lose that love. And the book of Revelation talks about it in chapter 2, where Jesus is writing to the church at Ephesus. And he's saying to them, you know, you guys were great. You have wonderful worship services. You do lots of good things for the poor. You're out at the Eaton Sidewalk sale. You're having all these gatherings like Millennial Mondays. But, he says, isn't there always a but? He says, but I have this against you. You have abandoned the love you had at first. You have abandoned the love you had at first. We need to stay in love with God. And Wesley said there are practices that can help us stay in love with God, things that we can do. Now, these aren't magic incantations to manipulate God, but they are things that we can practice, things we can live out that will help keep that love alive, just like we do in our earthly relationships. And for Wesley, practicing these ordinances really bring them in the center of God's grace. And they're things that Jesus did and modeled for his disciples. He also calls them means of grace, Wesley does. And they include things like corporate worship, prayer, reading the Bible, studying the scriptures together, fasting, and communion was a big part of that. Now, Wesley's list isn't exhaustive. If you're familiar with Richard Foster, the great writer and pastor who's gone on to be with the Lord, he wrote a book, Celebration of Discipline. He identified 12. There's no one right way to stay in love with God, but we need to be intentional about carrying these out. And so today, on Communion Sunday, we're focusing on what it means to stay in the table on this Communion Sunday. And Wesley believes so strongly in the power of communion that he himself would take it 4 or 5 times a week. We tend to celebrate it once a month. Our House of Prayer celebrates communion weekly. There's other opportunities to experience communion. It doesn't have to be in a church building. It doesn't have to be in a worship service. We learned during COVID that we can experience communion virtually, and if you're worshiping online, we're glad you're here. And interact with Pastor Kurt, our online pastor, throughout the service. But you can have your bread, your juice, your crackers, your water, whatever it is that you have, and experience communion together, to be at the table, to stay at the table. And in fact, one of the reasons the Methodist Church even exists was because Wesley wanted everyone to, in this new movement, to be able to receive communion, and that meant he had to start a church to have pastors that could help officiate at communion. And that's one of the reasons we have an open communion table. Anybody can come. You don't have to be a member of Garfield. You don't have to be a member of any church. You can be any age, from anywhere. And why do we do this? Well, how big was Jesus' table? How big was Jesus' table? It's for all. And Wesley believed, and I believe, that communion itself, the Lord's Supper itself, can be a converting ordinance, a converting discipline, that you can experience the living Jesus Christ right here, right now, today. Maybe for the first time, maybe for the 100th time. But there's power in this meal, especially when we stay at the table together. And when Jesus shared the Last Supper with his disciples, foretelling of his suffering and his death, he didn't give them a theory. He didn't give them a theological treatise. He didn't give them a PDF. He gave them a practice, something we could do together, to come to the table and to stay at the table in all the different ways that we talk about it. We say the Lord's Supper, we say the Eucharist, but however we talk about it, however we try to understand it, and I'll tell you the truth, you can't understand it. It's a mystery. It's a mystery that God gives to us. And so it's important to have theological discussions of what really happens, but the important thing is what really happens is that we encounter the living Christ at this table. And we have to stay at the table. We have to stay at it. In the words from 1 Corinthians 11 that Flora shared with us, Paul's writing to the church in Corinth, and he's addressing all kinds of issues they're having, including divisions at the table. They're together, but they're not acting very together. They're arguing about this and arguing about that. And so he says it's not even like the Lord's Supper anymore. You need to come together and stay together at the table. You need to stay together. There's a word in the Greek throughout different parts of this chapter, synerchomai, and what it means is to bring together, to come together, to connect things, maybe things that wouldn't connect otherwise, to bring together. And he says this word so many times because he knows that you can't stay in love with God unless you stay at the table together. So let's tune in to Pastor Chip as he talks to us about what it means to stay at the table together.
Hey, good morning, Garfield. It's good to be with you even this way. I'm not with you in person because today is my birthday. Now, that wouldn't mean a whole lot to me at this point in my life, but my kids always want to be together with Terry or myself as we've gotten older, and they always want to surprise us with something. Their surprises usually involve something that terrifies me, axe throwing, or something that'll have us running and screaming in the dark. So pray for me today. But it is a joy to be with my family. And it's a joy to team teach with my best friend and our executive pastor, Terry McHugh. She just talked to us about staying at the table. And I want to talk to us in this part about one of the most difficult things of doing that, and that's at staying at the table together. When God called me to preach, when God called me into the ministry, I argued with God, not that I didn't feel a call to preach, not that I didn't want to go out and deal with the fragmentation in the world and try to be a person that united and not divided, but I did ask God, can I do it and not go back to those people? You know who those people were for me? Church people. I'd been hurt by church people. At 17 years old, I took one of my African-American teammates to a very large church I attended. It happened to be all white, but I loved that church, and I was scolded by people for doing that. I was scolded by my own pastor. And I walked out of church at 17 and swore I'd never go back. After being in ministry, there's been times I didn't want to be around those people. In 1998, before I came to Garfield in 2004, for those 6 years, I was called to be a district superintendent. That's a supervising elder that I went down to southern Ohio, mid-Ohio, to oversee 80 churches as their supervising elder. I had a friend who pastored one of those churches. He said, hey, when you guys get down here, please come to our church first, and I'd love to see you, and we'll go to lunch after. So Terry and I and our family, we went to the church. We actually got there early, something I wasn't known to do. But I was a superintendent. I figured I needed to put on a good first impression. We walked in before service ever started, and there were a lot of older folks in that room. And when we came in, they got visibly uncomfortable. My wife and I happened to be an interracial marriage, if you're worshiping online or with us and didn't know that. And people began to glance and fidget. And finally, a woman in a pew right adjacent to us shouted out to her family, a very loud voice, and said, I would never let my son do that. Now, Terry and I, you have to hit us with a 2x4. We've gotten about any comment you can imagine. We take faith in God and in each other. That stuff really doesn't rattle us. But when the pastor came out and he went to the pulpit to give the morning announcements, he spied us in the front pew, and he said, oh my gosh, friends, we have our new superintendent and his wife here today. Terry, Chip, would you guys stand up? And when we stood up, I never looked to my right. I said to my wife, please tell me that woman's not on the floor. Please tell me she's not having a heart attack. Please tell me they have the AED. But you know, sometimes it's hard to stay at the table with those people, whoever those people are for you. I've preached in so many places. I think I've preached in every denomination and non-denomination somewhere along the way in some part of our country. And I've experienced communities of faith where joy is evident and love overflows, but I've experienced communities of faith where I feel like I have to go back through my Bible and say, now, where's the passage I missed where it says, when you accept Jesus, it makes you mean? It's hard sometimes to stay at the table together, even with those you disagree with, even with those you wish wouldn't behave the way they do. Along the way, I've had times where I thought of leaving. Some of my closest friends have said to me, why do you stay in a denomination? Why do you stay in a connection of churches? Why don't you just go start your own independent church? You'd be good at it. People would come. So every time I get asked that question, why don't you leave? I always bring back the same answer. Because of the table. Because of Jesus' table. Because of the upper room. On that last night of Jesus' life, he went into the upper room. He gathered his closest friends around his table to celebrate Passover, what would later become known as the Lord's Supper, as he revised it, as Terry has spoken about, and as we'll celebrate in just a few minutes. And at that table, the gospel writers tell on themselves. And they say that what we did at that table on that night was argue about who was the greatest. They were arguing about who was the greatest with Jesus in the room. Can you even imagine that? We sit around arguing about who's the greatest, and Jesus Christ is in the room with us. And at that moment, if I were Jesus, I would have said, this is my last night. You guys don't get it. You're all fired. I'm going to call down a band of angels to take care of this after you or instead of you. But he doesn't do that. In that moment, he gets down on his knees and he washes their dirty feet. The Lord of the universe, down on his knees with a towel and a basin, washing their feet. They were stunned at all this, and he told them afterwards, he said, I've done this for you as an example, so you all will stay together and wash one another's feet. After he did that and he got back to the table, he broke bread and he passed the cup. Now, we throw around the colloquialism of breaking bread very casually, but in that day and age, you've heard me teach on it before, or if some of you are new, you're hearing it for the first time. Per the Jewish halakha, the law of the land, to break bread with someone in that day and age meant you were under a covenant of friendship with them for life. Now, this is not Facebook friends, folks. This is a deep, deep, deep covenant of friendship. So deep is this commitment that if I was in covenant of friendship with you in that day and age, and you fell into debt at any time in your life, I would be obligated to pay your debt. If you died in battle or you had an untimely death, I, under covenant of friendship with you, would be obligated to raise your children. Now think about who Jesus was breaking bread with in that upper room. He had already told him, the shepherd will be struck and all the sheep, meaning all of them, will be scattered. He knew that they were all going to run for the hills. They were all going to leave him when he needed them most. And still, Jesus entered into a covenant of friendship and broke bread and served it with those people, right? Peter, who was supposed to be the rock, said, I will never deny you, Jesus, even if I need to die. And Jesus knew and said, on this very night, Peter, you will deny me 3 times. And he served and broke bread with Peter. The one that really cuts me to the heart is the fact that Judas was sitting in one of the seats of honor, and Jesus turned and broke bread and gave it to Judas. And basically what Jesus was doing at that moment was saying, go and do what you must, but I will always be your friend. It strikes me in the early church, they create a legend around that moment. If the Apostles' Creed, if you've ever said it, it said that Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate, was dead, crucified, dead and buried, and 3 days later rose again. But that's a modern translation. In the older translations of the Apostles' Creed, it said Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried, and on the 3rd day rose again. They inserted before the 3rd day rose again, he descended into hell. What is that descended into hell all about? Well, there's various biblical references that people pick up on. But in the early church, they had a legend that Jesus descended into hell because Judas was there. And two old friends met, and there was another kiss offered, where Judas had given the kiss of betrayal in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus, there in the shadows of hell, offered Judas a kiss of forgiveness. Now, that's not biblical. There's no biblical reference to that. But it is pretty consistent about what we know about Jesus and his intention to keep us at the table together. When Jesus would pray later after that moment in the upper room, in John 17, it was the longest prayer Jesus ever prayed in the Bible. It was the last thing he did for his followers before he would be arrested and go to the cross. And in his prayer, some scholars call it Jesus' only unanswered prayer. He prayed one thing for his coming church, for his disciples, and all those who would come to believe because of their testimony, which is you and I. He prayed that they would be one, completely one. He said, Father, as you and I are one. Jesus is so intent on keeping us at the table together. Those early disciples must have got a hint of it, because after the resurrection, after they had blown it, after Peter had betrayed and Judas had denied, and they had all run and hidden behind locked doors, it says in John 21:1, they were all back together. He names the disciples, John does, 7 of them that were there, and it said they were together. Hard stop. Not together 2, not together 4, just together. And Peter, who is broken in shame, says, I'm going fishing. I'm going back to my former life. And he's obviously in shame because John paints him a portrait of him in the boat naked. And nakedness was always a sign of shame. But when Peter says, I'm going to go back fishing, I'm going back to my former life, what did his friends do? They said, no, we'll go with you. And they were in the boat together. Stay at the table together. There's power in it. I heard a story written by Isak Dinesen, an amazing writer. And Dinesen tells a story called Babette's Feast. And in it, there's this woman named Babette. She is an amazing cook, chef for royalty in France. But she's ended up in this city of Denmark in the employ of 2 elderly sisters. It's a very dreary town. It's a community where they're very, very fundamentalist Christians. No joy in the world. And Babette has this dream to return to Paris. And she plays the lottery all the time with the hopes that she might win enough money to go back to Paris. She, every night, this amazing chef that nobody knows is a chef is under the rigid employ of these 2 elderly sisters. And every night they demand that she cook them the same dreary meal, boiled fish and potatoes, because they say Jesus commanded, take no thought of food and drink. One day the unbelievable happens. Babette wins the lottery. The prize is 10,000 francs, a small fortune. And because the anniversary of the founding of that community is approaching, Babette asks one last favor, that she might prepare a French dinner with all the trimmings for the entire village. At first, the townspeople refuse. No, they say it would be sin to indulge in such rich food, but Babette begs them, and finally they relent. They say, as a favor to you, we will allow you to serve us this French dinner, but the people secretly vow not to enjoy any of it, and instead to occupy their minds with spiritual things, believing God will not blame them for eating this sinful meal as long as they do not enjoy it. Babette begins her preparations. Caravans of exotic food arrive in the village, cages of quail and barrels of fine wine. Finally, the big day comes and the village gathers. The first course is an exquisite turtle soup. The diners force it down with no enjoyment. But although they eat in silence as usual, conversation suddenly begins to take off. Then comes the wine. Veuve Clicquot. All of you French people, I probably destroyed that. The year 1860, the finest wine in all of France. And the atmosphere changes. Someone smiles. Someone also giggles. An arm comes up and drapes over a shoulder. Someone is heard to say, after all, did not the Lord Jesus say, love one another? By the time the entree of quail arrives, those pleasure-fearing people are giggling and laughing and slurping and guffawing and praising God for their many years together. This pack of former Pharisees is transformed into a loving community through the gift of a meal. One of the two sisters goes into the kitchen to thank Babette, and she says to her, oh, how we will miss you when you return to Paris. Babette replies, I will not be returning to Paris because I have no money now. I spent it all on the feast. Can you think of anyone else who gave everything he had to build a beloved community with the gift of a meal? That was Jesus. You know, when we find ourselves at tables sometimes with people we disagree with, maybe we disagree with politically, maybe we don't understand them culturally, maybe they seem to represent those people that annoy us the most. When we get at those tables, maybe it's the tables that Jesus called us to be at. Isaiah says, come to my table where you can buy bread and wine without money and without price. That was the voice of God speaking of the ultimate feast and the ultimate kingdom and the feast that Jesus reminded us and presented to us and illustrated for us in the here and now. Every time you ask yourself, but I don't really want to be at that table, hear these words from C.S. Lewis, who says, do you realize when you're at those tables, a secret master of ceremonies has been at work? Christ, who said to his disciples, you have not chosen me, but I have chosen you, can truly say to every group that he gathers, you have not chosen one another, but I have chosen you for one another. And the friendship that happens there is a feast at which God reveals to each the beauty of all the others. It is God's instrument for creating as well as for revealing. At that feast, it is Jesus who has spread the board. It is he who has chosen the guests. And C.S. Lewis said, let us not deny the work of our host. There's a really terrible series that is, I don't know if it's continuing, but I think it went on for 6 or 7 seasons. I only stumbled across it once. I could only watch about 10 minutes of it. The title of the series, maybe you've heard of it, maybe you've seen it, is Wife Swap. Now, that's a terribly sexist title because it's not just wife swapping, but husbands are swapping. They take 2 couples and their families and they transport the wife to be with the other family as the wife and mom for a week while the other wife goes with the other family. It's a horrible idea. And it usually ends up, oh yeah, there's some touchy-feely tears, probably manufactured. But it's a terrible idea. It's the exact antithesis of this feast, of the one where we're called to stay at the table together. God did not tell us to spouse swap, to friend swap, to church swap, where it's all about our needs and our preferences and our politics and our opinions and our personal comfort. The host at the table that C.S. Lewis said we're not to deny, he said it this way, if any would be my followers, you need to deny yourselves and take up your cross daily and follow me. And when we follow Jesus, we're going to follow him to his table where he chooses the guest, where he makes the guest list, and he calls for us to sit there in a spirit of gratitude and to love others at that table as he has continually loved us. We're at the table with Jesus. And every time I'm tempted to leave, I look down and I see him at my feet, washing my feet. I sense him offering me the bread and the cup as he'll offer to you and to all of us today, and saying, you can't stay? I stayed there for you. I stayed on the cross for you. I love what one preacher said one time. When Jesus stayed on the cross, it wasn't the nails that kept him there. He could have called down a horde of angels. He could have disintegrated those nails. He made everything in the earth and all of the universe. But he stayed on that cross. It wasn't nails that kept him there. Love kept him there. And love, his love toward us, and the love that we're called to have toward others, should keep us together at the table too.
As we have said, this isn't Garfield table, it's God's table. It's the only meal where Jesus is both the feast and the host. And he invites us not only to come to the table, but to stay